Argentina is a country often celebrated for its tango, its football legends, and its vibrant culture. But beneath the rhythm of Buenos Aires and the snow-capped beauty of Patagonia lies a darker history, one that stretches from the ashes of World War II to the displacement of Argentina's own indigenous peoples. This is the story of how Argentina became the most infamous Nazi refuge in the world, and why the scars of that history are still visible today. Our story begins not in 1945, decades earlier. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Argentina was already engaged in an experiment of identity. Leaders wanted the nation to appear white and European, something they believed was essential for progress and modernization. Waves of immigrants from Italy, Spain, and Germany were welcomed with open arms. At the same time, Argentina's indigenous peoples, the Mapuche and many others, were being pushed aside, massacred, and erased from official records. Argentines, once a significant part of society, were written out of history as if they had never existed. By the 20th century, Argentina had constructed a European facade, but it was built on the silenced voices of its native and African-descended populations. This desire for European identity made Argentina the perfect landing ground for Nazis after World War II. When the war ended in 1945, countless Nazi officials, officers, and collaborators found themselves hunted by Allied forces. But through secret smuggling networks known as rat lines, thousands escaped Europe. With the help of sympathetic governments in Italy and Spain, and sometimes even the complicity of the Catholic Church, fugitives made their way across the Atlantic. And at the other end of those journeys often stood Argentina. Why Argentina? The answer lies partly in its leadership. President Juan Perón, who came to power in 1946, openly admired European fascism. He and his wife, Eva Perón, oversaw policies that gave shelter to German immigrants, including those with war crimes hanging over their heads. They believed German scientists, military men, and industrialists could help modernize Argentina. Among them was Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat known as the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann orchestrated the logistics of mass deportations of Jews to death camps. And yet, after the war, he slipped away from Europe and ended up in Buenos Aires, living under a false name. Another was Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death from Auschwitz, who performed gruesome experiments on prisoners. Mengele lived freely in Argentina for years, moving between German-speaking communities. Argentina wasn't just a place of refuge, it was a place where entire German enclaves flourished. Towns like San Carlos de Bariloche, nestled in the Andes, became infamous for their German schools, architecture, and festivals. While many were innocent immigrants, whispers persisted that Nazi sympathizers and even war criminals blended into these communities, keeping their ideology alive in subtle ways. But the story of Argentina's Nazi legacy isn't just about fugitives hiding in plain sight. It's also about the society that welcomed them and the unspoken price paid by those who had already been displaced. By the 1950s, Argentina had become a quiet sanctuary for hundreds of former Nazis and collaborators. Many lived comfortably, their pasts hidden behind false identities, but some, like Adolf Eichmann, would eventually be unmasked. In 1960, after years of intelligence work, Israel's Mossad tracked Eichmann to a modest house in a suburb of Buenos Aires. He lived as Ricardo Clement, working at a local Mercedes-Benz factory. When agents confirmed his identity, they orchestrated one of the most daring missions in intelligence history. Eichmann was kidnapped, smuggled out of Argentina on an El Al plane, and flown to Israel. There, he stood trial for crimes against humanity, and the world heard chilling details of how the Holocaust was organized. Eichmann's capture embarrassed Argentina on the global stage. Officials claimed outrage over Israel's violation of sovereignty, but the truth was more complicated. The operation exposed just how many Nazis had found protection under Perón's Argentina, and how deeply embedded those networks were. For many Argentines, it was the first undeniable glimpse of what their government had tolerated for years. Then there was Joseph Mengele. Unlike Eichmann, he was never caught. After leaving Auschwitz, Mengele drifted through South America, spending time in Buenos Aires and later Paraguay and Brazil. He lived among sympathetic German-speaking families, moved by the fear of being discovered. Despite international manhunts, Mengele died in 1979 after a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil. The fact that he evaded justice until his death remains one of the most haunting failures of post-war accountability. But Nazi fugitives weren't just individuals. They influenced entire communities. German enclaves like Bariloche developed reputations for harboring fascist sympathizers. In 1995, journalist Uki Gonyi uncovered extensive evidence of rat lines and Argentina's complicity in smuggling war criminals. His research showed how false passports, Red Cross documents, and government support allowed men guilty of genocide to walk the streets of Argentina with impunity. The story didn't end in the 20th century. In 2017, Argentine police discovered a hidden cache of Nazi artifacts in Buenos Aires, the largest ever found in the country. Among them were swastikas, busts of Hitler, and even devices reportedly used for racial science. Authorities concluded that these objects had likely belonged to high-ranking Nazis who fled to Argentina after the war. The discovery reignited public debate. How much of this legacy had truly disappeared, and how much had been quietly preserved? For modern Argentina, the legacy of harboring Nazis is inseparable from deeper issues of race and identity. The country's leaders once sought to make Argentina a white European nation, and in doing so, erased indigenous and Afro-Argentine communities from the national story. That same ideology of exclusion created fertile ground for welcoming European fascists. The Nazis who fled to Argentina were not anomalies. They were absorbed into a society already conditioned to value whiteness and European roots above all else. Today, echoes of this history still exist. Racism remains a problem in Argentina, particularly against indigenous peoples and migrants from neighboring countries like Bolivia and Paraguay. The Nazi past lingers, not just in artifacts and archives, but in cultural attitudes, shaped by decades of whitewashed history. As Argentina entered the late 20th century, it faced a reckoning. The global spotlight on Eichmann's trial, Mengeler's evasion of justice, and the discovery of Nazi enclaves forced uncomfortable questions. How could a nation that prided itself on democracy and culture become a refuge for war criminals? For many Argentines, the answer lay not in the past, but in the way Argentina constructed its identity. Argentina's elite had long sought to present the country as the Europe of South America. Immigration policies favored Europeans, and waves of German, Italian, and Spanish settlers reshaped cities like Buenos Aires. In this vision of modernity, indigenous and Afro-Argentine communities were excluded, marginalized, and written out of the national story. The arrival of Nazi fugitives, then, was not an aberration. It fit into a broader narrative of privileging European whiteness over diversity. By the 1970s, Argentina was again under military dictatorship. The junta launched the Dirty War, disappearing tens of thousands of its own citizens, activists, students, journalists, anyone accused of dissent. The parallels were disturbing. While the military was not explicitly Nazi, the machinery of repression, the torture centers, and the culture of impunity echoed fascist systems. For some historians, Argentina's willingness to shelter Nazis after World War II helped normalize authoritarian violence at home. The ghosts of this past still haunt Argentina today. In the town of Bariloche, for example, where Nazis once hid in the shadow of the Andes, German-style chalets and Oktoberfest celebrations remain part of the local identity. While most residents reject fascism, the presence of these cultural echoes has made Bariloche infamous as the Nazi hideout. Tourism, books, and documentaries continually revisit the theme, ensuring the story is never entirely forgotten. In 2017, the discovery of that Nazi artifact collection in Buenos Aires reminded the world that Argentina's ties to fascism weren't buried. They were preserved, sometimes literally, behind closed doors. Among the objects were medical instruments thought to be used for racial experiments. At the same time, Argentina has also taken steps toward accountability. Museums and educators now highlight the country's Nazi connections as cautionary tales. Jewish communities in Buenos Aires, the largest in Latin America, have pushed for remembrance, linking the fight against anti-Semitism to the broader struggle against racism and dictatorship. In this way, Argentina is slowly confronting the shadows of its past. Yet the legacy of displacement remains perhaps the most profound. Indigenous peoples and Afro-Argentines, largely erased by centuries of policy, remain underrepresented and often invisible in public life. This, too, is part of the story. Argentina's embrace of European fascists cannot be separated from its marginalization of its own native populations. Both are expressions of a society that for too long valued whiteness above justice. Today, when Argentina debates questions of identity, immigration, and racism, the history of harboring Nazis is never far away. It is not just about the individuals who fled across the Atlantic. It is about the structures that allowed them to thrive and the cultural scars they left behind. In the 21st century, Argentina continues to wrestle with its Nazi legacy, not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence in its cultural and political landscape. Documentaries, academic studies, and international investigations have peeled back the layers of secrecy, exposing just how deep the networks ran. From forged Red Cross papers to Vatican-linked smuggling routes, Argentina became the last chapter of the Third Reich's story, and that chapter has yet to fully close. Modern Argentina has positioned itself as a democracy that values human rights, hosting war crimes trials, opening archives, and cooperating with international Jewish organizations. Yet the uncomfortable truth lingers. For decades, successive governments allowed perpetrators of genocide to walk free in Argentine neighborhoods, sometimes under their real names. For survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants, this represents a double wound: the trauma of what was lost in Europe and the betrayal of a South American nation that promised sanctuary, but to the wrong people. The cultural residue is visible in small but striking ways. Bariloche, often called the Little Bavaria of the Andes, thrives on tourism that highlights its alpine charm. But just below the surface is its reputation as a Nazi hideaway. Even today, walking tours point out houses where fugitives like Erich Priebke once lived. Priebke himself was only extradited to Italy in the 1990s, half a century after his crimes. His long freedom in Argentina is a chilling reminder of how successfully Nazis blended into local communities. Beyond the German enclaves, Argentina's Nazi past also intersects with its broader history of authoritarianism. The Dirty War of the 1970s and 80s, during which up to 30,000 people were disappeared by the military dictatorship, drew on methods pioneered by fascist regimes. Torture, secret detention, and propaganda echoed what Nazis had once practiced in Europe. Historians argue that Argentina's post-war harboring of Nazis normalized a culture of silence and impunity that the junta later exploited. The international community has not forgotten. Each new revelation, from hidden artifacts to unsealed government files, renews interest in Argentina's role as a sanctuary for fascists. This has become a moral mirror for the nation. How do you reconcile tango, football, and cultural brilliance with the knowledge that your homeland also sheltered some of history's darkest figures? For many Argentines, the reckoning comes through education. Schools now teach Holocaust history, with emphasis on Argentina's complicity. Museums in Buenos Aires display artifacts and testimonies, drawing connections between the Holocaust and Argentina's own human rights abuses. This effort reflects a growing awareness that memory is not passive. It requires action, vigilance, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet perhaps the most lasting consequence is how this history reshaped Argentina's identity. The embrace of European fascists was tied to the nation's larger project of whitening and erasing indigenous and Afro-Argentine populations. Even today, indigenous communities face displacement and marginalization. In this sense, Argentina's Nazi past cannot be separated from its colonial legacy. The same structures that devalued native lives also made room for fascist fugitives. As Argentina moves forward, the lessons of its past are stark. When a nation prioritizes appearance over justice or identity over humanity, it creates space for darkness to take root. Argentina's Nazi legacy is not just about the crimes of foreigners who fled Europe. It is about the choices of a society that let them in, and the long shadow those choices still cast. Today, Argentina stands at a crossroads between remembrance and forgetting. The Nazi legacy is not only a matter for historians, but for a society still grappling with how deeply fascist ideologies once took root in its soil. Investigations continue to reveal caches of Nazi memorabilia hidden in private homes. One of the largest was uncovered as recently as 2017 in Buenos Aires, featuring busts of Hitler, swastikas, and medical instruments allegedly used for racial experiments. These discoveries are chilling, not because they are relics, but because they show how these symbols of hate quietly survived for decades, passed from generation generation to generation. At the same time, Argentina has become a place of resistance against the very ideologies it once harbored. Jewish communities, human rights groups, and descendants of the disappeared now lead efforts to ensure history cannot be rewritten. Public protests, art installations, and survivor testimonies are part of a cultural movement that insists Argentina face its ghosts head-on. This duality, being both a sanctuary for perpetrators and a stage for remembrance, defines Argentina's complicated identity in the 21st century. The story also resonates globally. Argentina is not alone in harboring fascist fugitives. Other South American nations like Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay played similar roles. But Argentina's case stands out because of its scale and the openness with which Nazis lived there. For the international community, this history raises a stark question. What happens when justice is delayed for half a century? What scars are left when accountability is postponed until it is too late for most victims to see it? Argentina's Nazi legacy is also entangled with its ongoing struggle with racism, inequality, and exclusion. Indigenous people continue to fight for recognition and land rights, while Afro-Argentines, once a significant presence, have been largely erased from the national narrative. The same ideology that saw value in European refugees, even Nazis, saw little value in preserving the voices of Argentina's original peoples. This is why the Nazi question is not just about foreign fugitives. It is about the structures of privilege and silence that shaped the nation itself. As we look back, the lesson is clear. History does not disappear simply because a nation wishes to turn the page. The shadows of fascism can persist in quiet communities, in inherited artifacts, or in the myths we tell about who belongs and who does not. Argentina's reckoning with its Nazi past is therefore not only about exposing fugitives, but about challenging the very conditions that made their acceptance possible. And so, the story ends where it began, with the question of memory. Will Argentina remember itself as a nation that offered safe haven to monsters, or as one that eventually chose truth over denial? Perhaps it will be remembered as both, but for the world, Argentina serves as a cautionary tale. Fascism does not vanish. It hides, waits, and survives, unless a society actively works to confront it. That is the haunting legacy of Argentina's Nazi past, and the urgent challenge of its present.